My name is Rick Alden. I am 70 years old, and for the last 5 years, I have lived a quiet, solitary life in a small, weathered cabin on the outskirts of Bellevue, Washington. To the neighbors, I am just a retired carpenter who spends his days sanding cedar planks and tending to a vegetable garden that never seems to produce enough to feed a family. They see the worn-out flannel shirts I wear, the splinters in my hands, and the old rusted Ford truck parked in my gravel driveway. They see a man who has clearly seen better days living out his sunset years in relative anonymity. If you are just tuning in to this story, take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is a sequence of events so cold, so calculated, that even now, looking back from the peace I have finally found, my hands still tremble. We like to think we know the people who share our blood. We like to believe that the history we build with our children is an armor, a protection against the cruelties of the outside world. I believed that. I believed it with every fiber of my being. But sometimes the people who know us the best are the ones who know exactly where to insert the blade. When my son Bradley called me 3 weeks ago to announce his wedding, I did not go to the bank to withdraw a fortune. I did not call a tailor for a bespoke tuxedo. I took the bus, wore the only suit I had left from my wife's funeral years ago, and carried a gift of a single handmade wooden rocking chair. I played the part. I played the part of the struggling retired laborer, the father who had nothing left to give but his presence. I played it because in the final years of her life, my wife Carolyn had warned me. She had seen the way Bradley's new fiancée Sylvia looked at the world not with love, but with a checklist. I knew then that my fortune, the $110 million Carolyn had left me from her early investments in the tech boom, would be a target. So I hid it. I buried it in layers of trusts and offshore accounts, shielded from every prying eye. And I waited. I waited to see who would show up when they thought there was nothing left to gain from me. I only had to wait 3 days. The morning sun was just beginning to burn through the thick Pacific Northwest fog when a sleek black SUV pulled into my gravel drive. It was entirely out of place here, like a diamond in a coal mine. I was on the front porch, focused on the steady rhythmic sound of my sandpaper against a piece of unfinished cedar. I didn't look up when the engine cut out. I didn't look up when the doors slammed shut. I kept my rhythm. Smooth, steady, consistent. That is the secret to a good finish. When the footsteps finally crunched on the gravel, stopping right at the edge of my porch, I lifted my eyes. My son Bradley stood there. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the world were pressing down on his chest. Beside him stood Sylvia, wearing a designer trench coat that probably cost more than my truck, and a tall, sharp-featured man I did not recognize carrying a heavy leather-bound briefcase. There was no warmth in Bradley's face. There was no, "How are you, Dad?" or "Did you sleep well, Bobs?" There was only the hollow, vacant look of a man who had already decided to trade his own flesh and blood for a seat at a table that would never welcome him. Sylvia took one look at my porch, recoiled as if the dust were a plague, and pulled her coat tighter around her. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't offer a smile. She looked at me the way one looks at a stain on a rug. "Mr. Alden." She started, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. "She didn't call me Dad. She never had. The best wedding gift you could give us, Mr. Alden, would be to sign these papers and disappear from our family life forever." The air on the porch seemed to vanish. I put the sandpaper down. I didn't stand up. I stayed exactly where I was sitting on the edge of the porch, looking up at them. Bradley refused to meet my eyes. He stared at his own polished loafers, digging his heel into the gravel, his jaw tight. The tall man behind them stepped forward, cleared his throat, and introduced himself as a legal mediator. He told me he was there to facilitate the smooth transition of my property. The conflict hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. In the span of 72 hours, the boy I had raised, the boy who used to sit on my lap while I read to him, had transformed into a stranger who was currently orchestrating my eviction. It was a calculated, brutal spike in the reality of my life. My own son, led by a woman he had barely known for a year, was standing on my porch, ready to strip me of the only shelter I had left. I looked at Bradley, waiting for a sign, any sign that this was some sick, twisted joke. But there was nothing. No flicker of regret. No hint of hesitation. Just a man who had made his choice. I realized then that my son was not just a guest in my life anymore. He was a trespasser in my home, and the predator he had brought with him had already begun to hunt. When my son got married, I kept my $110 million fortune a complete secret. I played the role of a tired, retired carpenter living in a dusty cabin. It turns out hiding that money was the smartest decision I have made in my 70 years of life. Because exactly 3 days after the wedding, a wedding I attended in a rusty truck and a cheap suit, my new daughter-in-law showed up unannounced at my front door. She was not there to bring leftovers. She brought a ruthless lawyer, a fake crisis, and a cold ultimatum to throw me out on the street. Welcome to my story. Take a deep breath, because what I uncovered in the next 48 hours will change how you look at the people you love the most. My name is Rick Alden. I am 70 years old, and for the last 5 years I have lived a quiet, solitary life in a small, weathered cabin on the outskirts of Bellevue, Washington. To the neighbors, I am just a retired carpenter who spends his days sanding cedar planks and tending to a vegetable garden that never seems to produce quite enough. They see the worn-out flannel shirts I wear, the splinters in my hands, and the old rusted Ford truck parked in my gravel driveway. They see a man who has clearly seen better days, living out his sunset years in relative anonymity. We like to think we know the people who share our blood. We like to believe that the history we build with our children is an armor, a protection against the cruelties of the outside world. I believed that. I believed it with every fiber of my being. But sometimes the people who know us the best are the ones who know exactly where to insert the blade. When my son Bradley called me to announce his wedding, I did not go to the bank to withdraw a fortune. I did not call a tailor for a bespoke tuxedo. I took the bus, wore the suit from my wife's funeral, and carried a handmade wooden rocking chair. I played the part. I played the part of the struggling retired laborer, the father who had nothing left to give but his physical presence. I played it because in the final years of her life, my wife Carolyn had warned me. She had seen the way Bradley's new fiancée Sylvia looked at the world. Not with love, but with a checklist. I knew then that my fortune, the $110 million Carolyn had left me from her early investments in the tech boom, would be a target. So I hid it. I buried it in complex layers of blind trusts and offshore accounts shielded from every prying eye. And I waited. I waited to see who would show up when they thought there was nothing left to gain from me. I only had to wait 3 days. The morning sun was just beginning to burn through the thick Pacific Northwest fog when a sleek black SUV pulled into my gravel driveway. It was entirely out of place here, like a diamond resting in a coal mine. I was sitting on the front porch, intensely focused on the steady, rhythmic sound of my sandpaper against a piece of unfinished cedar. I did not look up when the heavy engine cut out. I did not look up when the car doors slammed shut. I kept my rhythm going. Smooth, steady, consistent. That is the secret to a good finish. When the footsteps finally crunched on the gravel, stopping right at the edge of my wooden porch, I slowly lifted my eyes. My son Bradley stood there. He looked exhausted. His shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the world were pressing down on his chest. Beside him stood Sylvia, wearing a designer trench coat that probably cost more than my entire truck, and a tall, sharp-featured man I did not recognize carrying a heavy leather-bound briefcase. There was no warmth in Bradley's pale face. There was no casual greeting. There was only the hollow, vacant look of a man who had already decided to trade his own flesh and blood for a seat at a table that would never truly welcome him. Sylvia took one look at my porch, recoiled, as if the sawdust were a plague, and pulled her coat tighter around her. She did not offer a hand. She did not offer a smile. She looked at me the way one looks at a dirty stain on a pristine rug. "Mr. Alden." She started, her voice as sharp and cold as a surgical scalpel. She did not call me Dad. She never had. "The best wedding gift you could give us is to sign this house over and disappear from our family forever." The air on the porch seemed to completely vanish. I put the sandpaper down slowly. I did not stand up. I stayed exactly where I was sitting on the wooden steps, looking up at them. Bradley fiercely refused to meet my eyes. He stared at his polished loafers, digging his heel into the gravel, his jaw clenched tight. The tall man standing behind them stepped forward, cleared his throat with a practiced, arrogant authority, and introduced himself as a legal mediator. He told me he was there to facilitate the rapid, smooth transition of my property into their names. The sudden conflict hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. In 72 hours, the boy I raised, who used to sit on my lap while I read to him, had transformed into a stranger orchestrating my eviction. It was a cold, calculated, brutal strike. My own son, blindly led by a woman he had barely known for a year, was standing on my porch, ready to strip me of the only shelter I supposedly had left in the world. I looked at Bradley, desperately waiting for a sign, any sign at all, that this was some twisted, terrible mistake. But there was absolutely nothing. No flicker of regret. No hint of hesitation. "Bradley," I said, keeping my voice low, letting a tremor of feigned weakness slip into my tone. "What is she talking about?" "Disappear. This is my home. Where am I supposed to go?" Bradley finally lifted his heavy head. His eyes were cold, distant, completely devoid of the warmth that I remembered from his childhood. "I am sorry, Dad," he muttered, his voice flat, emotionless, and clearly rehearsed. "I do not have a choice. We need the equity in this land right now. It is the only way." He stepped back, aligning himself physically and emotionally with Sylvia and the sharp-suited lawyer. He had made his ultimate choice. I realized then that my son was not just a guest in my life anymore. He was a hostile trespasser in my home, and the predator he had brought with him had already begun to fiercely hunt. But what they did not know was that the helpless, clueless old carpenter sitting on the dusty steps was holding a hand of cards they could not possibly comprehend. I watched the heavy black SUV slowly reverse out of my driveway, its thick tires loudly crunching over the loose gravel. The large vehicle turned onto the main asphalt road and steadily disappeared into the thick gray morning fog. I stood perfectly still and waited patiently until the faint hum of its engine faded completely into the quiet rustle of the towering pine trees. For a very long, tense moment, the only sound left was the cool breeze sweeping across the wooden planks of my front porch. Then my entire demeanor rapidly changed. The violent trembling in my hands, a symptom of sudden shock and elderly frailty that I had projected just moments ago, stopped instantly. My hands became as steady as carved stone. The exhausted slump in my shoulders vanished. I stood up tall, stretching my back, shedding the persona of the broken father I had worn for their benefit. The tears that had welled up in my eyes dried in the cool morning air. I was no longer the clueless carpenter they thought they had easily cornered. I was a man who had just seen through a pathetic, desperate illusion. As I walked back into the quiet warmth of my cabin, my mind began to dissect every single second of the encounter on the porch. I replayed the conversation, stripping away emotion and analyzing the raw facts. Bradley had stood there, sweating and stammering, begging for his life. He had spoken of a massive real estate blunder, a devastating failure that had supposedly left him owing $400,000 to men who did not negotiate. He had painted a picture of physical danger, claiming loan sharks were breathing down his neck, ready to break his legs or throw him in a cell if he did not produce the cash by the end of the week. It was a terrifying story designed to exploit a father's instinct to protect his child. But as Bradley was delivering his rehearsed, tearful plea, my eyes had drifted to the woman standing proudly beside him. Sylvia had crossed her arms over her expensive trench coat, tapping her fingers impatiently against her arm. When she moved, Her sleeve slipped back just enough to reveal her left wrist. That was the exact moment their entire desperate narrative crumbled into dust. Resting perfectly on her wrist was a stunning new timepiece. It was a rose gold Patek Philippe Nautilus. I recognized the distinctive octagonal bezel, the horizontally embossed dial, and the delicate glimmer of custom-set diamonds catching the morning light. I know my luxury timepieces well because my late wife Carolyn was an avid collector of fine horology. That watch was not a casual purchase. It was an incredibly rare, highly sought-after masterpiece that retailed for no less than $60,000. I also knew with absolute certainty that Sylvia had not been wearing that watch 3 days ago at their wedding reception. Her wrists had been completely bare. The logical contradiction hit me with the force of a freight train. You do not buy a $60,000 diamond-encrusted watch when your husband is being actively hunted by violent criminals for a $400,000 debt. You do not walk into a luxury boutique and swipe a credit card when you are facing financial ruin and physical harm. If you were truly desperate, you would sell every piece of jewelry you owned to keep your husband out of a body bag. You certainly would not flaunt a brand new treasure while demanding a retired carpenter hand over the deed to his only home. The debt was a lie. The entire crisis was a meticulously crafted fabrication. Bradley was either the worst liar on the face of the planet, or he was entirely brainwashed, isolated from reality, and fed a script that he believed was his only salvation. Sylvia was the architect of this deception. She had manufactured a fictional crisis to create an artificial sense of urgency, forcing my son to evict his own father to secure a relatively small piece of property. But why go through such an elaborate, cruel charade just for an old wooden cabin worth a fraction of her new jewelry? I locked the heavy wooden front door and pulled the thick curtains shut, casting the living room into deep shadow. I walked past the rustic kitchen and opened the door leading down to my basement. The wooden stairs creaked familiarly beneath my boots as I descended into the cool, damp air below. The basement looked exactly like what anyone would expect from a retired blue-collar worker. It was filled with old workbenches, scattered hand tools, jars of assorted nails, and the rich, comforting scent of cut pine and machine oil. Everything about the space screamed of a simple, hard-working life. I walked past the main workbench and stopped in front of a massive, heavy steel tool cabinet bolted against the far concrete wall. It looked immovable, weighed down by decades of accumulated hardware. But I reached down, grabbed a concealed handle near the bottom edge, and firmly pulled. The entire cabinet slid smoothly to the left on a hidden, well-oiled set of industrial tracks. Behind the cabinet, flush with the cold gray concrete, was a state-of-the-art biometric wall safe. It was sleek, modern, and entirely invisible to the naked eye. I pressed my right thumb against the small glass scanner. A soft mechanical click echoed in the quiet basement, followed by a faint beep as a tiny LED light blinked from red to green. The heavy steel door popped open, or popped. I reached inside the dark cavity and pulled out a matte, black, military-grade encrypted laptop. It was heavy, cold to the touch, and contained access to networks and accounts that did not formally exist in my name. I carried the machine over to my dusty workbench, clearing away a pile of wood shavings with my forearm. I flipped open the screen and pressed the power button. As the system booted up, requiring a complex sequence of passwords and secondary authentications, I let the reality of the situation settle over me. I had spent 5 years playing the role of a ghost, a quiet widower living out his days in a forgotten corner of the world. I had hidden my wealth to protect my son from the predators Carolyn had always feared. Hiding had only delayed the inevitable. The predator had arrived anyway, wearing a white dress and a sweet, venomous smile. She thought she was hunting a weak, vulnerable old man. She thought she could use my love to strip me of my dignity and my home. She thought she held all the power because she controlled Bradley. But as the secure network connection established on my screen glowing brightly in the dim basement, I knew she had made a fatal miscalculation. She had assumed that the surface was all there was to see. She was about to discover that the old carpenter she despised was not helpless at all. I sat down on my wooden stool, placed my hands on the keyboard, and prepared to fight back. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale bluish light across the sawdust covering my worn denim jeans. I typed in a 32-character alphanumeric sequence, a complex password I changed every 30 days without fail. A secure portal loaded instantly, bypassing standard internet protocols and routing directly to a private server hosted securely in Manhattan. I clicked on a single unnamed application icon. A video feed initiated, ringing twice before the screen split in half. On the other end of the connection sat Mitchell Reed, framed perfectly by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office overlooking Central Park. Mitchell was a powerful man who moved billions of dollars before breakfast, yet he always answered my calls immediately. He straightened his tailored suit tie as he saw my face, his professional demeanor softening into a look of genuine concern. He knew I only used this specific communication channel for absolute emergencies. "Robert," Mitchell said, his voice crisp and clear through the laptop speakers. "I was not expecting to hear from you today. Is everything all right in Seattle?" I took a slow, steady breath, letting the heavy silence stretch for a fraction of a second. "No, Mitchell. Everything is incredibly far from all right. I need you to drop whatever you are currently working on and give me your complete, undivided attention." Mitchell immediately leaned forward, resting his forearms on his pristine mahogany desk. "You have it. Tell me exactly what is happening." "Bradley was just here," I began, keeping my tone deliberately flat to mask the lingering sting of deep betrayal. "He showed up at my front door with his new wife Sylvia and a man who introduced himself as a legal mediator. They came to demand that I sign over the deed to my house. They told me to pack my things and disappear forever." Mitchell did not gasp or act shocked. He was a seasoned wealth manager accustomed to the dark, ugly side of human greed. Instead, his eyes narrowed rapidly, calculating the legal implications. "And what reason did they give for this sudden eviction?" "A fabricated crisis," I replied. Sylvia spun a frantic story about Bradley making a disastrous real estate investment. She claimed he owes $400,000 to dangerous private lenders who will physically harm him if he does not pay. They want the equity in my cabin to supposedly save his life. Mitchell sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Robert, we both know that cabin is a tiny fraction of what you actually hold. If Bradley truly needed $400,000, you could effortlessly wire it to him from your secondary accounts right now without even making a dent in the principal." "I know," I said. "But Bradley does not know that. He has absolutely no idea, and that was the undeniable crux of the entire devastating situation. My son, the boy who had just looked me in the eye and asked me to render myself homeless, believed I was nothing more than a retired laborer living on a meager fixed income. He did not know about the massive Carolyn Trust. He did not know that his mother, my brilliant, fiercely protective wife, had secured patents for foundational data compression algorithms in the late 1990s. He did not know that those exclusive patents had eventually been sold and licensed to massive global tech conglomerates, generating an astonishing fortune. Carolyn had insisted on absolute unbreakable secrecy. She grew up in grinding poverty, and when the money finally flooded in, she was terrified it would ruin our son. She wanted Bradley to truly understand the enduring value of a hard day of work. She wanted him to build his own career, to face his own inevitable struggles, and to earn his own victories without the toxic safety net of endless unearned wealth. When she passed away, she placed the entire $110 million into a heavily guarded, irrevocable trust. I was the sole trustee. Bradley was not to see a single dime until his 40th birthday, or until I personally deemed him responsible enough to handle the immense burden of that much financial power. Carolyn always said that sudden money attracts dangerous predators. I murmured, staring directly at the faint reflection of my own tired face in the glowing laptop screen. She warned me that if people thought we were rich, we would never know who actually loved us for who we are. So we lived simply, We drove old cars. We stayed in this modest house. I played the part of the struggling blue-collar worker perfectly. You did, Mitchell agreed, his voice steady and respectful. And because of that severe discipline, the Carolyn Trust has grown significantly under our management. The asset portfolio is entirely secure. But Robert, if Bradley does not know about the money, why are they specifically targeting your house? A $300,000 property is a surprisingly small prize for such an aggressive, highly coordinated ambush. That is exactly what I intend to find out right now, I said, my voice hardening with resolve. Sylvia was wearing a brand-new custom-engraved luxury watch on my porch today. A $60,000 watch. A woman terrified of violent loan sharks does not make that kind of extravagant purchase. The massive debt is a complete lie. The panic is a carefully rehearsed performance. She is manufacturing a fake crisis to force me into signing very real legal documents tomorrow morning. Mitchell began typing rapidly on a secondary keyboard positioned slightly off-screen. What exactly do they want you to sign? They left a thick stack of paperwork for my supposed review, I explained, glancing cautiously toward the wooden staircase that led back up to my living room. I will scan and transmit every single page to your secure inbox in a few minutes. But right now, I need you to initiate a massive covert background check. I need a complete deep dive into my son's life. Understood, Mitchell said without hesitation. What are the specific parameters? I want a microscopic analysis of Bradley's financial history over the last 5 years. I instructed, articulating every word with absolute chilling precision. Check his credit reports, his personal bank statements, his tax returns, and any registered business affiliations. Dig into his employment records. I need to know if there is a single shred of truth to this $400,000 debt. I need to know if he owes money to a bank, an individual, a casino, or anyone else on this planet. I will have my top forensic accountants pull his data immediately, Mitchell promised. What about the wife? Sylvia, I said, saying her name felt like biting down on a piece of bitter tinfoil. I want her entire life stripped bare. Run her background through every database you can, legally and quietly access. Look for civil lawsuits, previous marriages, bankruptcy filings, and any history of financial fraud. I want to know exactly who her associates are. I want to know if she has ever pulled a stunt like this before. She brought a very sharp, very confident lawyer to my door. They moved too smoothly. They functioned like a well-rehearsed professional team. This does not feel like her first time executing this kind of aggressive, manipulative maneuver. Mitchell nodded once, his expression grim and completely focused on the task. I will put the elite private investigative team on it right now. We will trace every transaction and cross-reference every public record available. We are completely out of time, Mitchell, I warned him, leaning closer to the cold, bright screen. They are coming back to my house tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock to collect my signature. That gives us less than 24 hours to figure out exactly what kind of trap my new daughter-in-law has set for me. I need comprehensive answers before the sun comes up. You will have a comprehensive dossier in your secure inbox before midnight. Mitchell assured me, his tone radiating absolute professional certainty. Robert, please be extremely careful. If this woman is brazen enough to attempt an eviction 3 days after her wedding, she is highly dangerous. I know, I replied softly, my gaze hardening. But she made one catastrophic mistake today. She assumed I was exactly what I appeared to be. I am going to end this call now and send you those documents. Do not ever contact me on any standard phone line. We communicate only through this encrypted portal. I reached for the keyboard, my deep resolve cemented firmly in stone. The hours that followed were a grueling test of my patience. I sat in the dim light of my basement, surrounded by the quiet hum of the encrypted laptop and the faint scent of sawdust that clung to my clothes. The silence in the house above me felt heavy, pressing down on the floorboards like a physical weight. I made a simple cup of black coffee, sipping the bitter liquid as I stared at the glowing screen. Every minute that ticked by felt like an eternity. I ran through every possible scenario in my head, trying to find a logical explanation for my son's behavior. I wanted to believe that Bradley was simply in over his head, that he had made a terrible mistake and was too ashamed to tell me the truth. I wanted to believe that the fear I saw in his eyes on my front porch was genuine fear of dangerous lenders rather than the fear of a manipulative wife. But my gut instinct told me otherwise. The image of that $60,000 watch flashed in my mind. It was a glaring anomaly, a crack in their facade. At exactly 11:45 that evening, the secure portal on my laptop screen chimed softly. The video feed re-established instantly. Mitchell Reed appeared on the screen looking just as impeccably sharp as he had hours earlier, though the dark skyline of New York City now stretched out behind him through his office windows. His expression was serious, devoid of any pleasantries. He had the hard, focused look of a man who had just uncovered something deeply troubling. "Robert," Mitchell began, his voice cutting through the quiet basement. "My forensic team has completed the preliminary sweep of Bradley's financial history. We pulled data from every credit bureau, banking institution, and tax registry available. We cross-referenced his Social Security number against known private lending networks and commercial debt databases." I leaned closer to the screen, my hands resting flat on the wooden workbench. "Tell me exactly what you found, Mitchell. Do not hold anything back." Mitchell took a slow breath. "We found absolutely nothing. Bradley's financial record is completely spotless. His credit score is excellent. He has a standard mortgage on his primary residence, which is entirely up to date. He has a very manageable auto loan and typical credit card usage, all paid off in full every single month. There are no outstanding liens. There are no sudden liquidations of assets. There is no evidence of catastrophic real estate investments anywhere in his portfolio." I felt a cold chill wash over my chest. "What about private lenders? Could he have borrowed money off the books from dangerous people?" "Highly unlikely," Mitchell stated firmly. "When a person owes $400,000 to underground lenders, there are always digital footprints. We would see unexplained cash deposits, desperate liquidations of retirement accounts, or sudden transfers to obscure offshore holding companies. Bradley has zero anomalous activity. Furthermore, his income as a mid-level sales director is stable, but it does not support the kind of extravagant lifestyle that involves purchasing $60,000 timepieces. The story they told you today, Robert, is a complete fabrication. The dangerous loan sharks do not exist. The crushing debt is a total lie." I sat back on my wooden stool, absorbing the heavy impact of his words. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion. It was a verified fact. My own son had stood on my front porch, looked me directly in the eyes, and lied to my face to justify throwing me out of my home. But the deeper I looked into the deception, the less sense it made. "Mitchell," I said, my voice dropping to a low whisper, "if there is no debt, then they do not actually need $400,000 to save his life. My cabin and the small plot of land it sits on are worth roughly $300,000 on the current market. It is a modest property in an average neighborhood." I paused, letting the pieces of the puzzle shift and align in my mind. Sylvia brought a highly polished, aggressive corporate lawyer to my door today, a man who introduced himself as a legal mediator but carried the demeanor of a high-priced litigator. You do not hire a shark like that, a man who probably bills $500 an hour to aggressively seize a simple wooden cabin from a supposedly broke retired carpenter. The math does not work. The effort does not match the prize. Why go through this elaborate charade for a small piece of property? Mitchell frowned, leaning closer to his camera. "You are absolutely right, Robert. The return on investment for a property of that size does not justify bringing in specialized legal counsel, especially not under the guise of an emergency eviction. If they just wanted the house, they could have easily waited for you to pass away or gently manipulated you into a standard title transfer over time. This sudden, frantic ambush suggests they are after something else entirely." The realization hit me with terrifying clarity. The house was never the true target. The house was merely a distraction. It was a shiny object dangled in front of my face to make me focus on losing my shelter while the real theft happened right under my nose. The entire manufactured crisis, the tears, the fake loan sharks, the aggressive lawyer. It was all a carefully constructed stage play designed to force me into a state of panic. They wanted me to be so terrified for my son's physical safety that I would blindly sign whatever documents they pushed across the table. "The documents," I said, suddenly reaching for the thick stack of papers Sylvia had so arrogantly tossed onto my workbench earlier that afternoon. "The house is a Trojan horse, Mitchell. They do not care about the cedar siding or the gravel driveway. They care about what is hidden inside the legal paperwork they left for me to sign." I grabbed the stack of papers, feeling the heavy weight of the legal bond. It was dozens of pages long, filled with dense, tiny print and complex legal jargon. A standard property deed transfer is usually a few simple pages. This document was thick enough to be a corporate merger. "They told me it was a simple transition of property." I continued rapidly flipping through the pages. "They told me to review it and sign it by tomorrow morning to save Bradley's life. But there is a reason they brought a specialized attorney. There is a reason they created a fake timeline of 24 hours. They want to rush me. They want me to sign this without showing it to my own legal counsel. They are using my paternal instinct as a weapon to blind me to the details." I slowly turned on the small digital scanner, carefully feeding the very first page into the glowing machine, to finally discover exactly what kind of devastating legal trap patiently awaited me in the early morning. The soft, methodical hum of the portable document scanner filled the quiet, damp air of my basement. I fed the crisp pages of the contract into the machine one by one, watching the bright green light sweep across the dense blocks of text. The physical act of handling the paperwork felt strangely grounding, a repetitive motion that kept my mounting anger firmly in check. These pages had been printed just hours ago, smelling faintly of a high-end corporate office. Sylvia had probably stood over the printer, fully believing she had engineered the perfect crime. She assumed I was a tired, poorly educated laborer who would simply glance at the signature line and surrender my property to save my son. She had severely underestimated the man she was trying to destroy. As the final page slid through the scanner, I compiled the digital images into a single encrypted file. I typed a brief command on my laptop and transmitted the entire package through the secure portal directly to Mitchell Reed and his elite team of corporate attorneys in Manhattan. The loading bar on my screen filled rapidly, sending the evidence of my daughter-in-law's betrayal across the country. When the transfer was complete, I leaned back on my wooden stool and exhaled slowly. The silence of the basement crept back in. I was alone with the crushing reality that my son had stood on my front porch and actively participated in a scheme to render me homeless. The wait for Mitchell to call back was agonizing. I found myself staring at the rough, unfinished cedar planks stacked neatly in the corner of my workshop. I thought about the decades I had spent building a life with Carolyn, the careful, deliberate choices we made to protect our son from the toxic influence of sudden wealth. We had shielded him from the $110 million trust because we loved him. Now that very shield was being used against me. Sylvia had somehow convinced Bradley that I was nothing more than an expendable burden, a disposable asset standing in the way of their financial salvation. 20 minutes later, the secure communication portal chimed sharply. I opened my eyes and immediately accepted the incoming video call. Mitchell appeared on the screen. Sitting beside him at the expansive mahogany desk was a stern-looking woman with graying hair and sharp glasses, whom I recognized as Evelyn Hayes, the senior legal counsel for the Carolyn Trust. Both of them looked deeply unsettled. Their professional composure was clearly strained by whatever they had just uncovered in the scanned documents. "Robert," Mitchell began, his voice unusually tight and grave, "we have completed a comprehensive review of the paperwork Sylvia left for you. I need you to brace yourself. The situation is significantly worse than a simple property theft." I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the desk. "Tell me exactly what she is trying to do, Mitchell. Give it to me without any sugar-coating." Evelyn adjusted her glasses and looked directly into the camera. Mr. Alden, the first 11 pages of this document are exactly what they claimed them to be. They outline a standard quitclaim deed designed to legally and rapidly transfer the full ownership of your property located in Bellevue to Bradley and Sylvia. If you signed only the first 11 pages, you would simply lose your home. Evelyn paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. However, the true danger is completely buried in the middle of the document. I need you to open the digital file on your screen and scroll down to page 12. I opened the file and scrolled past the dense paragraphs detailing property lines until I reached the 12th page. At first glance, it looked like a standard continuation of the real estate agreement, filled with the same complex, monotonous legal jargon meant to exhaust the reader. There were no bold headings, no clear warnings, and absolutely no indication that the subject matter had drastically changed. Look at the third paragraph, subsection C. Evelyn instructed, her voice dropping to a serious, chilling register. I read the text carefully, my eyes tracking across the complicated, twisted sentences. It took me a moment to translate the heavy legalese into plain English. As the true meaning of the words finally crystallized in my mind, a wave of profound nausea washed over me. "This is not a real estate clause," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "This is a durable power of attorney." "It is much more than just a financial power of attorney, Robert," Evelyn corrected me firmly. "It is a comprehensive, irrevocable medical and financial proxy. The way this specific subsection is drafted, by signing the final page of this contract, you would be legally declaring yourself unfit to manage your own affairs. You would be surrendering total, absolute legal control of your life directly to Sylvia." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. Total control. What exactly does that mean in practical terms? Mitchell answered, his expression dark with restrained anger. "It means she would have immediate legal authority to act. She could drain your personal bank accounts, sell your vehicles, and cancel your credit cards. It means she could intercept your mail and isolate you from the outside world. But most terrifyingly, Robert, it grants her full medical proxy. She would have the sole authority to dictate your health care. She could legally forcibly commit you to a locked psychiatric ward against your will, and you would have absolutely no legal recourse to stop her." The sheer scale of the malice took my breath away. Sylvia did not just want my house. She wanted to erase my autonomy. She wanted to strip me of my fundamental human rights and turn me into a legal captive. The fake debt, the terrifying story about violent loan sharks, the aggressive lawyer pushing for a signature in 24 hours. It was all a meticulously designed psychological operation. They were banking on my panic. They were relying on my paternal love to completely blind me. They wanted me so desperate to save Bradley that I would flip to the last page and sign my own name, unknowingly locking the legal shackles around my own wrists. "It is a fast track to a complete conservatorship," Evelyn explained, breaking the heavy silence. "Once you sign this document, Sylvia can walk into a courthouse on Monday morning, present your signature to a judge, and legally declare you incompetent. From that moment on, you cease to be an independent adult. You become her prisoner." I looked away from the laptop, staring into the dark shadows of my basement. The magnitude of the betrayal was almost too massive to fully comprehend. My son had brought a woman to my door who intended to lock me away in a facility until the day I finally died. Did my son Bradley truly know, or was he completely blinded by her lies? I knew what I had to do next. I had to let Sylvia believe she had successfully won. Tomorrow morning I would finally finalize the ultimate trap for them both. I gently closed the encrypted laptop, severing the secure connection with Mitchell and Evelyn. The screen faded to black, plunging the basement back into its familiar dusty dimness. The silence of the cabin wrapped around me, heavy and suffocating. Any normal man in my position would have immediately picked up a telephone and dialed the local authorities. A rational person would have reported the attempted fraud, handed over the fraudulent documents, and let the criminal justice system handle Sylvia and her ruthless corporate lawyer. But I was not just dealing with a pair of ordinary criminals. I was dealing with a deeply insidious threat, that had its claws firmly embedded in my only son. Calling the police now would prematurely trigger an explosive confrontation, and it would leave Bradley in the crossfire, potentially painting him as a willing accomplice to elder abuse and financial fraud. I needed absolute, undeniable proof of Sylvia's singular malice. I needed to catch her completely off guard, operating under the arrogant assumption that she held all the power. I needed to let her dig her own grave, and I needed to record every single shovelful of dirt. I stood up from my wooden stool and walked toward the far corner of my basement. Behind a stack of untreated cedar planks and a row of rusted metal toolboxes, there was another hidden compartment. While my neighbors believed I spent my days whittling birdhouses and struggling to pay for groceries, my previous life had required a significant amount of specialized security. I pulled away a heavy canvas tarp and unlocked a reinforced steel lockbox. Inside lay an assortment of high-grade surveillance equipment. These were not the cheap commercial cameras you could purchase at a local hardware store. They were sophisticated military-grade devices designed to capture crystal-clear, high-definition audio and video without ever being detected by standard sweeping equipment. I carefully selected 3 micro cameras, each no larger than the head of a pushpin, and a compact, highly sensitive audio transmitter. I carried the equipment upstairs, moving quietly through the empty, silent rooms of my cabin. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long, stretching shadows across the worn wooden floors. I started in the main living room, the exact place where the final confrontation was scheduled to occur tomorrow morning. My large, custom-built oak bookshelf dominated the back wall. It was filled with thick, dusty volumes of carpentry manuals, historical biographies, and old photo albums. I meticulously drilled a tiny, almost invisible hole into the dark spine of a thick, leather-bound encyclopedia. I threaded the delicate wiring through the back of the shelf, securing the first micro camera perfectly flush with the book's spine. It provided a wide, unobstructed view of the front door, the sofa, and the heavy oak coffee table where the treacherous legal documents would eventually be signed. Next, I moved into the rustic kitchen. The large wooden kitchen island was the central hub of the house, a place where Bradley and I had shared countless cups of coffee over the years. I crawled underneath the heavy wooden counter, lying flat on my back on the cold linoleum floor. I used a specialized adhesive to firmly attach the high-grade audio bug directly beneath the thickest part of the wood. The transmitter was incredibly sensitive, capable of picking up a faint whisper from 30 feet away, while automatically filtering out background static. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously wiring the remaining cameras, hiding one inside the casing of the wall-mounted thermostat, and another within the hollow base of a wrought iron floor lamp. Every wire was perfectly concealed. Every angle was flawlessly calibrated. I routed the encrypted feeds directly to my secure laptop in the basement, ensuring that the recordings would be immediately uploaded to Mitchell's private servers in New York. Even if Sylvia somehow managed to destroy the physical cameras, the digital evidence of her crimes would already be thousands of miles away, completely beyond her reach. When the physical installation was finally complete, I stood in the center of the living room, breathing heavily, my hands covered in a thin layer of drywall dust. I wiped my brow with the back of my sleeve and stepped toward the bookshelf to make a final adjustment to the encyclopedia. As my fingers brushed against the leather bindings, they caught the edge of an old faded photograph tucked between 2 thick volumes. I gently pulled the picture out, feeling a sudden violent ache in the center of my chest. It was a photograph of Bradley when he was just 10 years old. He was standing in our old driveway, wearing a pair of oversized, grease-stained overalls, proudly holding a wooden birdhouse we had built together. His young face was completely covered in sawdust, and he was smiling with a bright, innocent joy that radiated absolute trust. I stared at the photograph, tracing the outline of my son's face with my rough, calloused thumb. The emotional toll of the day finally crashed down upon me, threatening to break my rigid composure. How had that sweet, innocent boy turned into the terrified, desperate man standing on my porch this morning? How had he allowed a woman he had only known for a year to manipulate him into participating in an elaborate, cruel plot to legally enslave his own father? I wrestled with the agonizing reality of his involvement. Part of my heart desperately wanted to believe that Bradley was entirely a victim, completely brainwashed by Sylvia's toxic lies, isolated from reality, and genuinely terrified for his life. But another darker part of my mind whispered a different story. Bradley had stood there and lied to my face. He had delivered a rehearsed, tearful performance about loan sharks and impending violence. Even if Sylvia had written the script, Bradley had willingly delivered the lines. He had made a conscious choice to prioritize his new wife's manufactured crisis over my basic human dignity. The pain of that realization was sharper than any physical wound I had ever endured. I carefully placed the photograph back on the shelf, swallowing the bitter lump in my throat. I could not afford to let grief cloud my judgment. I had to remain cold, analytical, and completely focused on the trap I had just set. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and began to wash the dust and grime from my hands. The cool water ran over my knuckles, soothing the tension in my muscles. I was mentally preparing myself for a long, sleepless night of waiting. I planned to sit in the dark reviewing the legal statutes regarding conservatorship fraud, memorizing every possible angle of attack. I was fully expecting to face Sylvia and her sharp-suited lawyer at 9 o'clock the next morning, exactly as they had aggressively demanded. I reached for a small white cotton towel hanging from the oven door and slowly began drying my hands. Suddenly, the sharp, heavy sound of a fist striking the thick wood of my front door echoed violently through the quiet cabin. I froze immediately, the cotton towel slipping from my grasp and landing softly on the linoleum floor. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs. I glanced at the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of the hallway. It was barely 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They were not supposed to return until the following morning. I moved silently across the kitchen, keeping my footsteps light, and retrieved a small tablet from the counter. It was connected directly to the newly installed surveillance network. I tapped the screen, bringing up the live video feed from the camera hidden in the thermostat. Standing on my front porch, completely uninvited, and a full day early, was Sylvia. She had changed out of her pristine morning attire and was now wearing a sharp-tailored black business suit that made her look even more like a corporate predator. Standing directly behind her, holding a sleek black leather briefcase, was Harrison, the aggressively confident lawyer who had demanded my signature. They were looking through the small glass panes of the door, their expressions tight with impatient arrogance. They had not come to peacefully negotiate. They had come to escalate the pressure. Sylvia knocked again, harder this time, her voice cutting through the heavy wooden door with a sharp, commanding edge. She called out, claiming they were just stopping by to check on my packing progress and to ensure I was ready for the transition. The true battle was starting right now. The sun rose over the Bellevue pines, casting long, sharp shadows across my gravel driveway. I had not slept a single wink. I had spent the entire night preparing the cabin, transforming my humble home into a meticulously wired stage. Tiny high-definition microphones were now seamlessly integrated into the wooden beams of the kitchen ceiling and tucked behind the rustic baseboards near the dining area. I had tested the audio frequencies multiple times throughout the early dawn hours to ensure every whisper would be captured. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy crunch of thick tires announced their arrival. I stood in front of the hallway mirror and finalized my physical transformation. I unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of my flannel shirt, leaving the collar crooked and severely mismatched. I forcefully rubbed my hands through my gray hair until it stood up in wild, unkempt tufts. I let my shoulders slump forward, collapsing my chest to appear frail, exhausted, and severely diminished by the weight of my son's fictional troubles. I practiced a vacant, distant stare in the glass. When the demanding knock finally rattled my front door, I shuffled forward, dragging my heavy work boots across the floorboards. I unlocked the deadbolt with violently trembling hands and slowly pulled the door open. Sylvia stood there, dressed in a sharp, tailored slate-gray pantsuit, looking more like a ruthless corporate executioner than a joyful new bride. Beside her stood the tall, sharp-featured lawyer, holding his expensive leather briefcase tightly against his side. Bradley was noticeably absent. I squinted against the bright morning light blinking rapidly, as if my frail eyes could not process the simple shapes standing directly in front of me. I let my jaw drop slightly, maintaining a confused, open-mouthed expression of pure, unadulterated bewilderment. "Bradley," I asked, my voice cracking into a high, reedy pitch that perfectly mimicked advanced senility. "Where is Bradley? Did he not come with you to fix the leaking roof today?" Sylvia let out a sharp, highly exasperated sigh. The sweet, desperate daughter-in-law from yesterday had completely vanished, replaced by an icy predator. "Robert, we talked about this extensively yesterday," she said, her voice obnoxiously loud, painfully slow and dripping with aggressive condescension. "Bradley is currently at work. He is fixing the terrible financial mess he made. Remember, we are here to sign the legal papers to help him stay out of trouble." I gripped the edge of the doorframe, letting my knuckles turn white while my knees visibly shook beneath my denim jeans. "Papers, right. The papers for the bank. Are you the man from the bank?" I looked at the lawyer, narrowing my eyes as if trying to piece together a deeply fractured memory. "You were here yesterday to fix the old truck, right? Or was it the plumbing?" The lawyer Harrison shot a highly amused, knowing glance at Sylvia. He visibly relaxed completely, buying into the pathetic display standing in front of him. "I am Harrison, Mr. Alden. I am the legal mediator. We are here to help you secure the property deed so Bradley does not go to jail. We need to get this completely finalized quickly." Sylvia pushed past me without waiting for a polite invitation, marching directly into my cabin as if she already possessed the legal title. She looked around the rustic living room with a sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. "Come along, Robert. Let us go sit at the kitchen table right now," she commanded, treating me exactly like a deeply confused toddler who had wandered away from a secure nursing facility. I shuffled after them, my steps intentionally uneven, clumsy, and highly hesitant. I kept rubbing my wrinkled forehead, muttering quietly to myself about missing carpentry tools, unpaid electric bills, and a neighbor who had supposedly stolen my lawnmower. When we finally reached the kitchen, Harrison placed his heavy briefcase on the polished oak table and snapped the brass latches open with a loud click. Sylvia pulled out a wooden chair and impatiently gestured for me to sit, rolling her eyes dramatically as I fumbled awkwardly to pull myself into the seat. "He is significantly worse today," Sylvia murmured to Harrison, completely ignoring the blatant fact that I was sitting less than 3 feet away from her. The sudden stress of Bradley's massive debt must have rapidly accelerated his cognitive decline. It is actually a massive blessing we are stepping in right now before he accidentally burns this entire cabin down. Harrison smirked, pulling the thick stack of papers out of his dark briefcase. "Indeed, it is a clear case of advanced mental deterioration. A family court judge will take one look at his medical evaluation and rubber stamp the conservatorship without a second thought. This proxy will magically save you months of exhausting legal battling." They were openly, gleefully gloating. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so utterly convinced of my total incompetence, that they were discussing the mechanical details of stealing my life directly in front of my face. I stared blankly at the thick document as Harrison slid it across the table, placing a heavy gold-plated pen right next to my trembling right hand. "I should offer you both some water," I stammered, looking around the kitchen in an exaggerated state of feigned distress. "Carolyn always firmly said I absolutely need to offer guests water. It is only polite. Let me just get the glass pitcher." Sylvia groaned heavily, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "Robert, we do not need any water. We just need you to pick up that pen and sign the bottom of page 12. I ignored her entirely, pushing myself up from the wooden chair with a loud, incredibly pained groan. I shuffled slowly over to the kitchen counter and grabbed the heavy, full-glass pitcher of freezing ice water I had prepared specifically for this exact moment. I carried it back to the table, my hands violently shaking, the large ice cubes clinking loudly against the thick glass. "Here we go," I mumbled, hovering directly over the thick legal documents. I allowed my grip to intentionally dramatically falter. The heavy glass pitcher slipped entirely from my trembling fingers, crashing incredibly hard onto the solid wooden table. A massive wave of freezing ice-cold water violently splashed across the oak surface, instantly soaking Harrison's tailored suit and heavily saturating the first several vital pages of the Trojan horse document. "Oh my God!" Sylvia shrieked, jumping backward as the freezing water splashed aggressively against her designer pantsuit. Harrison cursed loudly, desperately, snatching his leather briefcase and holding the completely ruined papers up in the air as water dripped steadily from their soaked edges onto the floor. "I am so incredibly sorry," I cried out, shrinking back and fearfully covering my face as if terrified they might physically strike me. My hands, they just completely stopped working. "I am so sorry. Let me get a mop. I know exactly where the mop is. I will fix it." Without waiting for a response, I turned and practically scrambled out the back door, rushing out into the attached garage. The heavy wooden door clicked securely shut behind me. I stood in the cool, quiet garage and took a deep, steadying breath. My hands were perfectly still. I walked over to my workbench and picked up a small, discreet pair of wireless headphones. I slipped them securely over my ears. Sylvia and Harrison were now completely alone in my kitchen, furiously trying to dry the ruined documents. They were standing exactly directly above the primary high-definition microphone I had securely embedded in the central ceiling beam. I pressed the audio feed button, and their panicked, unfiltered voices flooded into my ears in crystal-clear clarity, revealing the dark, ugly truth behind their polished facade and giving me the exact leverage I needed to completely destroy them. The cool air of the garage surrounded me as I stood perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the blank wooden door separating me from the two monsters in my kitchen. Through the wireless headphones, the audio feed was incredibly sharp. I could hear the frantic rustling of wet paper and heavy sighs echoing off the wooden beams. Then Harrison spoke, his voice completely stripped of the professional mediator persona he had adopted for my benefit. "God, this place reeks," Harrison muttered, his tone dripping with disgust. "It smells like cheap pine, damp earth, and old man. How does anyone actually live in this squalor? My suit is completely ruined, Sylvia. This water is going to leave a stain on the wool." I heard Sylvia's heels as she paced across the kitchen floor. "Oh, stop whining, Harrison," she snapped, her voice vicious. "It is just ice water. You can buy 10 suits by next week. Just endure the smell for one more day. We are almost at the finish line." "I am just saying," Harrison complained, "the old fool is deteriorating faster than I anticipated. Did you see his hands shaking? He is completely losing his mind." Sylvia let out a cruel laugh that chilled me to my core. "It is absolutely perfect. His performance makes our case foolproof. Once he signs the conservatorship clause on page 12, we lock him in the Sunnydale Psychiatric Facility by Friday. The director owes me a massive favor, and he has already prepared a secure room in the locked ward. Robert will be medicated, isolated, and completely stripped of his rights." I closed my eyes, feeling a spike of adrenaline pierce my chest. Sunnydale. It was a notoriously bleak facility on the outskirts of the county, a place where forgotten people were sent to fade away into nothingness. The sheer, calculated malice of her plan was breathtaking. She was actively trying to erase my existence. "Fine," Harrison sighed. "But I have to ask. We are taking a massive legal risk here. Fraudulent proxy, forced conservatorship, manipulating a senior citizen. If the board catches wind of this, I lose my license and we face serious prison time. Are you absolutely sure the money is actually there? A cabin is absolutely not worth this level of criminal exposure." I held my breath, waiting for her answer. I needed to know exactly how much she had uncovered. "Harrison, please," Sylvia said, her voice vibrating with arrogant confidence. "Do you honestly think I would marry that weak loser Bradley for a dusty cabin in Bellevue? I do not care about this worthless property. This house is just the key to unlock the actual vault." "So you have verified the assets?" Harrison pressed. I hired a private investigator 3 months before the wedding, Sylvia revealed. I knew Bradley was hiding something. He always acted broke, but he had expensive tastes. My investigator dug deep. He bypassed the standard banking records and found the holding companies. He traced the corporate structures all the way back to Robert's late wife, Carolyn. I gripped the edge of my workbench. She knew about Carolyn. Carolyn filed foundational tech patents in the late 90s. Sylvia continued, practically salivating. She sold them for an absolute fortune. Robert is sitting on an irrevocable trust worth exactly $110 million. It is all sitting in secure, high-yield accounts, completely untouched, waiting for someone smart enough to claim it. And Bradley knows nothing about this massive fortune, Harrison asked, sounding genuinely stunned. Bradley is a complete idiot, Sylvia spat. He genuinely believes his father is a penniless carpenter. Robert hid the money from him to teach him the value of hard work or some other moral nonsense. It is almost too easy. Bradley is so desperate for my approval that he will do anything I tell him. He actually believes he owes dangerous loan sharks $400,000 because I hired actors to threaten him. The horrifying truth washed over me in suffocating waves. Bradley was not a willing participant in the theft of my estate. He was a pawn. He was a manipulated, terrified victim of a woman who had orchestrated a flawless psychological assault. She had manufactured the threats and positioned herself as his savior to guide him toward this exact moment. So what is the master plan once the old man is locked away in the psych ward? Harrison asked. It is incredibly simple, Sylvia explained, echoing coldly through the microphone. Once Robert signs this document, he is legally incompetent. According to the bylaws of the Carolyn Trust, if the trustee is medically incapacitated, the sole control of the entire $110 million estate immediately defaults to the primary beneficiary, the next of kin, Bradley. And since Bradley is completely under your thumb, Harrison realized, his tone shifting into dark admiration. Exactly, Sylvia purred. Bradley gains total legal control of the trust. I give it 6 months. Let the dust settle. Let Robert rot in Sunnydale. Then I initiate phase 2. I file for a swift, no-fault divorce. Since we live in a community property state, and the trust control will have been transferred during the course of our marriage, I walk away with half. $55 million, Harrison. Clean and completely legal. And you get your promised 10% cut for facilitating the paperwork. $55 million, Harrison repeated softly, a greedy smile practically audible in his voice. You are an absolute sociopath, Sylvia. I genuinely respect that. Just make sure you dry those pages properly, she ordered him. We need his signature in 10 minutes. I want this done today. I pulled the wireless headphones from my ears, placing them gently onto the workbench. The dark air felt heavy in my lungs, but my mind had never been clearer. Sylvia had laid out her entire strategy, detailing every cruel step she intended to take to destroy my family. She manipulated my son, mocked my wife's legacy, and planned to throw me into a locked prison. She thought she was the smartest person in the room, but she had made a fatal error. She confessed her conspiracy directly into a recording device. I did not feel like a frail, confused old man anymore. I felt a surge of cold, focused power coursing through my veins. The sorrow I felt for Bradley's weakness was overshadowed by the wrath I felt toward the woman trying to destroy him. I reached over to the corner of the garage and grabbed the stringy mop leaning against the concrete wall. I grabbed a bright yellow plastic bucket, intentionally letting it clatter very loudly against my heavy work boots. I needed to return to the kitchen immediately. I needed to look absolutely pathetic. I desperately needed to carefully play the final act of this senile performance flawlessly. Because tomorrow morning, when the sun finally rose and the legal deadlines expired, I was truly going to unleash an absolute inferno upon Sylvia and Harrison. I was going to tear down her perfect, arrogant illusion and completely bury her under the crushing weight of the massive ghost fortune she so desperately craved. I gripped the rough wooden handle of the mop so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white in the dim light of the garage. The cold reality of what I had just listened to washed over me, chilling the blood in my veins. My son, the boy I had raised to be strong and independent, was completely oblivious to the darkest parts of this twisted conspiracy. He knew absolutely nothing about the massive trust fund his mother had left behind. He knew nothing about the locked psychiatric ward at Sunnydale. He had no idea that the woman he had just married was actively plotting to divorce him and strip him of a fortune he did not even know he possessed. She had not just lied to me. She had been systematically gaslighting Bradley for months. She had isolated him from his friends, manipulated his emotions, and fed him a constant terrifying diet of fabricated threats. She had hired actors to play violent loan sharks, creating a psychological pressure cooker that broke my son down until he was functioning on pure blind panic. She convinced him that the only way to save his own life and to secure his future with her was to sacrifice his father. Bradley was a coward. He was deeply, profoundly weak for choosing to evict me rather than coming to me for honest help. He had failed the ultimate test of character. But he was not the architect of this evil. He was a victim caught in the jaws of a ruthless predator. My profound heartbreak, the crushing sorrow of seeing my son stand on my porch as an enemy began to evaporate. It was rapidly replaced by a sensation I had not felt since the days I fought tooth and nail to secure Carolyn's patents against hostile corporate raiders. It was pure, cold, unadulterated fury. Sylvia was a parasite. She had crawled into my family, wrapped her venomous coils around my weak son, and decided to feast upon the legacy my wife had literally worked herself into an early grave to build. She looked at our lives and saw nothing but a massive payday. She looked at me and saw a disposable obstacle. I closed my eyes and took a long, deep breath, forcing my racing heartbeat to slow to a steady, rhythmic thud. I needed to separate the furious father from the calculating executor. If I stormed into that kitchen right now and confronted them with the truth, Sylvia would simply deny it. She would drag Bradley away, isolate him further, and inevitably find another angle of attack. I could not just win a shouting match. I had to completely and utterly dismantle her. I had to let her believe she had won the war right up until the exact second the ground opened up beneath her feet. I placed the wireless earpiece securely onto the hidden shelf behind a stack of rusted paint cans. I picked up the plastic yellow bucket, making sure it knocked loudly against the doorframe as I pushed my way back into the kitchen. I immediately slumped my shoulders, collapsing my posture back into the terrified, senile old man they expected to see. "I have the mop," I stammered, my voice trembling with manufactured fear. I kept my eyes fixed on the wet floor, aggressively avoiding eye contact. "I am so sorry. My hands just slipped. I will clean it up right now. Please do not be angry." I began to drag the stringy mop across the soaked hardwood, my movements intentionally slow and uncoordinated. I pushed the dirty water back and forth, breathing heavily, playing the role of the broken patriarch to absolute perfection. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Harrison meticulously wiping the last few drops of water from his expensive leather briefcase. He looked thoroughly disgusted, his lips curled into a tight sneer. "The documents are completely ruined, Robert," Sylvia said, her voice sharp and loud, echoing off the kitchen walls. She spoke to me with the dripping condescension of a frustrated warden addressing a troublesome inmate. "You have completely ruined the legal paperwork that is supposed to save your son from being hurt. Do you understand what you have done with your clumsiness?" "I did not mean to," I whined, leaning heavily on the wooden mop handle, as if I could barely stand under my own weight. "I just wanted to get you some ice water. Will Bradley go to jail now? Please do not let them take Bradley." Sylvia exchanged a deeply arrogant, victorious look with Harrison. She practically salivated at the sight of my pathetic performance. She was feeding on my supposed misery. "We are going to have to print fresh copies of the entire agreement tonight," she declared, stepping away from the puddle to protect her designer shoes. "Harrison will go back to his office and prepare a brand new stack. We will return tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. And Robert, you are going to sit at this table and sign every single page without any more accidents. Do you understand me? Tomorrow at 9, I repeated, nodding my head so frantically that my unkempt hair fell into my eyes. "Yes, I promise. I will sign whatever you need." Just tell the bank to leave Bradley alone. I will be ready. I will not spill anything tomorrow." "See that you do," Harrison muttered, adjusting his damp suit jacket. "This process is already taking far more of my time than I anticipated. Be ready, Mr. Alden. No more games." Sylvia did not even bother to say goodbye. She turned on her heel and marched out of the kitchen, her expensive perfume leaving a sickly sweet trail in the damp air. Harrison followed closely behind her, carrying his briefcase like a shield. I stood frozen in the center of the kitchen, leaning weakly against the mop, and listened to their footsteps cross the living room. I heard the heavy front door open and slam shut. I waited for the unmistakable sound of the heavy SUV engine rumbling to life. I listened as the tires crunched over the gravel, the sound fading steadily down the long, winding road, until the quiet peace of the forest completely returned to my cabin. The second the silence enveloped the house, my trembling stopped. I dropped the mop handle. It hit the wet floor with a dull thud. I rolled my shoulders back, standing up to my full height. The fog of senility vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, calculating mask of absolute determination. I walked calmly to the front window and pulled the thick curtains tightly shut, plunging the room back into secure shadows. I turned and walked directly to the basement door, my steps firm and measured. I descended the wooden stairs, the familiar creak comforting my focused mind. I approached the hidden safe, my thumb pressing against the biometric scanner. The green light flashed, and I pulled the heavy steel door open. I grabbed the encrypted laptop, carried it to the workbench, and flipped the screen open. The secure portal was still active, waiting for my command. I typed in the sequence to initiate a direct voice connection. It rang only once before Mitchell Reed answered. "Robert," Mitchell said, his voice tense with anticipation. "Did you secure the documents?" "I neutralized their paperwork for the night," I replied, my voice hard and resonant in the quiet basement. "They are returning tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock with fresh copies." "But Mitchell, I recorded their private conversation. Bradley knows absolutely nothing about the trust or the psychiatric ward. Sylvia has been psychologically torturing him for months to force this eviction. She knows about the $110 million. She intends to lock me in Sunnydale, manipulate Bradley into inheriting the control, and then divorce him to steal exactly half of Carolyn's legacy." A heavy silence fell over the encrypted line as Mitchell absorbed the sheer magnitude of the sinister plot. "That is an astonishing level of criminal malice," he finally said, his professional composure briefly cracking. "She is a complete monster, Robert. We have to contact the authorities immediately. We have enough to file injunctions by morning." "No," I commanded, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "We are not running to the police, and we are not hiding behind court injunctions. If we strike now, she will play the victim. She will claim it was a misunderstanding and slip away to try again. I want to crush her so completely that she can never recover. I want her to sign her own financial death warrant in my kitchen tomorrow morning." "What are you instructing me to do, Robert?" Mitchell asked, his voice steadying into a sharp, lethal professionalism. "I am going to sign her documents tomorrow," I stated clearly. "But I am going to make sure the ink she desperately wants is the exact poison that destroys her. I need you to bypass the standard legal protocols tonight. Wake up the entire corporate defense team if you have to." I leaned into the microphone, my eyes reflecting the harsh blue light of the monitor. "Mitchell, prepare the predator clause." The silence stretching across the encrypted connection was profound and heavy. Mitchell Reed stared through the screen from his Manhattan office, processing the sheer gravity of the command I had issued. I could see city lights glittering in his dark eyes as he leaned closer to the lens. The atmosphere inside my cold basement shifted instantly from a defensive panic to a highly calculated offensive strategy. I was no longer a victim waiting to be slaughtered. I was the executioner preparing the final strike. "Robert," Mitchell breathed, his voice laced with absolute professional awe and deep respect. "You have not mentioned that specific legal provision in over 5 years. We both hoped it would remain entirely dormant for the rest of your natural life. Hope is a fragile luxury that we can no longer afford to maintain," I replied, my voice echoing firmly against the concrete walls. Sylvia has successfully crossed every conceivable boundary of human decency. She wants to play a ruthless game of absolute control. Therefore, we are going to change the rules of her game now. To understand the absolute genius of the trap we were about to spring, one had to truly understand my late wife. Carolyn was not just a brilliant software engineer and a pioneer of modern data compression algorithms. She was also a woman who possessed a paranoid understanding of human nature. Growing up with nothing, she had seen what sudden money could do to families. She knew wealth was a powerful magnet for opportunistic parasites. When the tech patents generated massive global revenue, transforming us into centimillionaires, Carolyn went to work fortifying the perimeter. She spent countless hours with elite legal teams drafting the most impenetrable trust structure legally permissible. She was terrified that if I were left alone in my twilight years, the immense weight of the fortune would make me a target. She foresaw a terrifying scenario where someone might try to bypass standard inheritance laws by attacking my physical or mental autonomy. She knew a predatory outsider might manipulate our son to seize the assets by declaring me legally incompetent. She built a fortress, I murmured, recalling the intense late-night conversations Carolyn and I had shared at the kitchen table. She told me that the only way to completely defeat a parasite was to completely poison the host. Mitchell nodded slowly, his fingers flying across his secondary keyboard as he accessed the deepest restricted files within his secure network. Carolyn was a visionary in every sense of the word. The legal framework she designed for the trust is a masterpiece of aggressive asset protection. I am pulling up the specific activation protocols right now. The predator clause was a dormant legal trigger permanently embedded in the foundational charter of the Carolyn Trust. It functioned exactly like a digital dead man's switch. Under standard operating conditions, the $110 million estate would simply pass to Bradley upon my death. However, if anyone attempted a hostile takeover, the rules instantly mutated. The clause stated that if any individual attempted to seize control via an involuntary conservatorship or a legally contested declaration of mental incompetence, a catastrophic financial lockdown would immediately commence. Reviewing the exact phrasing now, Mitchell stated, rapidly scanning the dense legal text populating his monitor. If the triggering condition is met, the entirety of the $110 million trust is instantly, automatically, and irrevocably transferred into a locked charitable foundation. The funds are immediately dispersed across 12 international philanthropic organizations dedicated to medical research. The primary beneficiary, meaning your son Bradley, is instantly disinherited. The trust completely evaporates. It becomes totally untouchable by any family member, any spouse, and any legal entity attempting to claim jurisdiction over your affairs. The absolute beauty of the mechanism was its devastating permanence. Sylvia thought she was setting up a brilliant legal maneuver to steal $55 million. She believed that by getting my signature on that power of attorney, she was opening the vault door. She had no idea that turning the key would trigger an explosive device that would vaporize the entire fortune. I need the trigger primed and ready to deploy the second I give you the final signal. I instructed, my eyes locked onto Mitchell's face. She is bringing the fresh documents to my house at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I am going to sign the paperwork exactly as she demands. I will hand her the loaded weapon she desperately craves. Mitchell paused his typing, looking at me with a sharp, critical gaze. Robert, we must be incredibly precise here. We cannot risk a protracted court battle where her lawyers try to invalidate the trust parameters. We need to execute this flawlessly. Simply signing the power of attorney under duress is dangerous. If you sign it, she technically gains temporary power before we can legally register the hostile nature of the act. To activate the predator clause cleanly, we need undeniable ironclad proof of her malicious intent. I have the audio recordings from today. I reminded him, gesturing toward the wireless receiver resting on my workbench. She confessed her entire plan to Harrison in my kitchen. Audio recorded without consent is a difficult tool in a civil court, Robert, Mitchell cautioned, leaning back in his leather chair. It provides necessary context, but a skilled litigator like Harrison could potentially tie us up in endless jurisdictional hearings regarding privacy violations. We need something much stronger. We need a voluntary, undeniable admission of intent from Sylvia while the actual document is being executed. She needs to explicitly state her hostile intent to use the medical proxy to institutionalize you and seize control. If we have that confirmed admission at the exact moment of signing, the predator clause triggers flawlessly, and her legal authority is instantly nullified before she can leave your driveway. I stared at the blinking green light of my biometric safe, a cold smile forming on my lips. The path forward was suddenly crystal clear. I had spent 5 years playing the role of the quiet, accommodating father. I had spent today playing the role of the broken, senile victim. Tomorrow I would give Sylvia enough rope to securely hang herself. I understand precisely what you need, Mitchell, I said, my voice resolute. I have the perfect stage already built. My cabin is wired for high-definition audio, but I will not need hidden microphones for tomorrow. I will make sure she says exactly what we need her to say, directly to my face, proudly and loudly. You make sure your legal team is standing by to execute the transfer. The network is fully armed, Robert, Mitchell confirmed, his tone radiating absolute confidence. The moment you give me the verbal confirmation tomorrow, the $110 million will be moved beyond her reach forever. She will inherit nothing but dust. Thank you, Mitchell, I replied softly. I terminated the secure connection, plunging the basement back into complete silence. I closed the heavy laptop, the metallic click echoing in damp air. The trap was set. The ultimate consequence was loaded. I walked up the wooden stairs to prepare for the dawn. Morning light filtered through the pine trees. I sat in silence at my table, nursing cold coffee, and watched the clock tick toward 9. I needed to center my mind, burying the ache of a broken heart beneath tactical resolve. I was executing a maneuver that would permanently alter my family line. At exactly 9 o'clock, the crunch of tires on gravel shattered the quiet. The SUV jerked to a halt in the driveway. I took a deep breath to anchor myself in the role of the bewildered old man. I let my shoulders slump, forcing a tremor into my hands. Hearing the sharp knock, I shuffled slowly to the door. I pulled the door open. Sylvia wore a sharp white blazer radiating arrogant triumph. Harrison stood beside her, his expression a mask of professional impatience. My eyes bypassed the predators and locked onto my son. Bradley looked terrible. His face was pale, a thin sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes, and his hands were stuffed in his pockets. He looked like a man walking to his own execution, consumed by the terrifying illusion Sylvia had built around him. He stared stubbornly at the floor. "Good morning, Robert," Sylvia announced, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that contradicted the vicious words I recorded yesterday. "We are back as promised. May we come inside to finalize this minor paperwork?" I stepped aside. "Yes, come in. I made some coffee but forgot to turn the machine on. My mind is just scattered today." Sylvia brushed past me. "Do not worry about coffee, Robert. We are on a tight schedule. Let us head into the living room and get this over with." I followed them, gesturing toward the large coffee table. Harrison did not waste a second. He unlatched his briefcase with a sharp click, pulling out a freshly printed stack of legal documents. He laid the thick stack squarely in the center of the table. Then he pulled a silver pen from his pocket and placed it deliberately next to the signature line on the final page. "Everything has been reprinted for your signature," Harrison stated. "As discussed, this will transfer the property deed and establish the necessary proxies to resolve Bradley's financial liabilities. We just need your signature on the last page, and we will leave you in peace." Bradley hovered near the doorway, shifting his weight. He looked like a trapped animal, desperate to escape but paralyzed by fear. Sylvia stood behind the table, watching me with the unblinking focus of a hawk tracking a mouse. I approached the table, my hands trembling violently as I touched the document. I stared at the legalese, knowing exactly what insidious poison was buried on page 12. Picking up that silver pen and signing my name was the trigger that would detonate the explosive trap I built with Mitchell. Before I initiated the final sequence, I needed to know that my son was truly lost. I needed to give him one last opportunity to save his own soul. I pulled my hand back and slowly turned to face my son. I let the facade of senility drop just enough to show the raw pain of a father pleading for honesty. "Bradley," I said, my voice quiet but incredibly steady. "Look at me, please." Bradley flinched. His eyes finally met mine, and I saw a swirling vortex of guilt, panic, and overwhelming exhaustion. "I am about to sign away my home," I continued, speaking directly to him. "I am about to sign away everything I have left to protect you. Before I put my name on this paper, I need you to look me in the eye and answer me honestly. Are you absolutely sure this is the only way to solve your problem?" Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I took a slow step toward him. "Are you truly sure she is telling you the truth about all of this, Bradley? If you are in trouble, if you are in real danger, you can tell me. We can figure it out together. You do not have to do this. Just tell me the truth." For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of profound hesitation in Bradley's eyes. I saw the little boy I had raised, searching for a way out of the terrifying corner he had backed himself into. He looked like he was about to crack, to break down, and confess everything about the loan sharks, the threats, and the crushing pressure. But then Sylvia moved. She did not say a word. She simply shifted her weight, turning her head to fix Bradley with a cold, terrifying glare. It was a look of absolute dominance, a silent threat promising endless misery if he dared to deviate from her crafted script. She had spent months isolating him, gaslighting him, and conditioning him to believe she was his only lifeline. Bradley saw her look, and the brief flicker of courage in his eyes instantly died. The hesitation evaporated, replaced by the hollow submission of a man who had completely surrendered his own free will. He was terrified of the fake mobsters, but he was far more terrified of the very real monster standing beside the coffee table. He quickly looked away from me, staring back down at the floorboards. His shoulders slumped in total defeat. "Just sign it, Dad," Bradley muttered, his voice barely rising above a pathetic, broken whisper. "Please, we just need you to sign it so we can leave." That was the moment the cord finally snapped. I stared at him, feeling absolute emptiness. The heartbreak I carried vanished instantly, hardening into pure, unyielding ice. I realized that my son could not be saved from himself. Bradley was a coward. He was a weak, easily manipulated vessel who would rather destroy his own father than face a difficult truth or stand up to a tyrant. He had made his choice, and he had chosen the predator over his own flesh and blood. Sylvia smiled, a triumphant, wicked smirk spreading across her face. She thought she had just witnessed my spirit breaking. She thought my hesitation was the final thrashing of a defeated old man, realizing he had no options left. She had completely misread the room. "You heard him, Robert," Sylvia said, tapping a perfectly manicured fingernail against the top of the legal document. "Bradley has made his position very clear. We do not have time for emotional delays. Pick up the pen and sign the papers." I slowly turned back to the table. The trembling in my hands disappeared completely. I did not feel frail. I did not feel old. I felt the immense, crushing weight of a $110 million ghost fortune aligning directly behind my right hand. I reached down and picked up the heavy silver pen. The metal felt cold and absolute against my skin. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of their ruin, and the true grand finale was finally ready to begin right now. I held the heavy silver pen in my right hand, feeling its cool, polished surface against my skin. Sylvia and Harrison watched me with bated breath, their eyes hungry, anticipating the precise moment the ink would touch the paper and seal my doom. Bradley remained staring at the floorboards, completely broken and useless. I looked at the tip of the pen, hovering mere inches above the signature line. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I lowered my hand. I did not sign my name. Instead, I placed the silver pen gently onto the glass surface of the coffee table. The soft click echoed loudly in the tense, silent room. Sylvia frowned, her perfect facade cracking with sudden, sharp irritation. She opened her mouth to snap at me, to deliver another condescending reprimand, but the words died in her throat. She watched completely paralyzed as the miraculous transformation took place right in front of her eyes. The violent, uncontrollable trembling in my hands vanished instantly, replaced by absolute rock-solid stillness. I rolled my shoulders backward, the painful slump of my spine straightening out completely. I expanded my chest, drawing in a long, deep breath of air, and stood up to my full height. The bewildered, terrified expression melted from my face, washing away the frail, senile old man they thought they had cornered. In his place stood the man who had spent decades ruthlessly defending a corporate empire against predators far more dangerous than the two amateurs sitting in my living room. I looked directly into Sylvia's eyes. When I finally spoke, my voice was no longer a high, reedy whisper. It dropped an entire octave, resonating with a deep, cold, and heavy authority that commanded absolute silence. "I have read your paperwork," I said, my tone flat and stripped of all emotion. I placed my fingertips on the thick stack of legal documents and pushed. The heavy contract slid across the smooth glass of the coffee table, coming to a dead stop directly in front of Harrison. The lawyer blinked, his smug, confident smile faltering slightly as he looked from the contract up to my face. "Page 12, I stated, my voice slicing through the thick tension in the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. "Article 4, subsection C. The durable power of attorney." Harrison physically flinched, his shoulders jerking backward against the fabric of the sofa. The color began to rapidly drain from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and pale. "It is a remarkably clumsy attempt at a forced conservatorship, Harrison." I continued, leaning slightly forward, projecting my authority across the table. "You buried an irrevocable medical and financial proxy inside a standard property transfer deed. You intentionally masked a hostile takeover behind pages of irrelevant real estate jargon. Honestly, I expected a much higher caliber of legal drafting from someone attempting to steal $55 million. Your phrasing is amateurish, your execution is sloppy, and your reliance on my supposed mental decline is an absolute insult to my intelligence." The room descended into a state of absolute, suffocating paralysis. Harrison sat completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to formulate a single coherent response. His eyes darted frantically toward the front door, the terrifying realization of his severe criminal exposure finally crashing down upon him. Sylvia was a statue. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the sofa so tightly that her knuckles were pure white. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, her chest heaving as her mind desperately tried to comprehend how the helpless victim she had been mocking for months was suddenly dismantling her flawless master plan with clinical precision. Bradley looked up, his eyes wide and completely bewildered. He looked at me, then at Sylvia, and then back at me. He had absolutely no idea what a durable power of attorney was, and the mention of $55 million had completely short-circuited his panicked mind. "Dad," Bradley stammered, his voice laced with profound confusion. "What are you talking about?" "What $55 million? This is just about the deed to the cabin to pay off the loan sharks. Sylvia said you just needed to sign the deed." I did not break eye contact with Sylvia. I held her terrified gaze, letting her drown in the rising tide of her own absolute ruin. "Sylvia says a great many things, Bradley," I replied, at my voice steady and cold. "She tells you exactly what you need to hear to keep you paralyzed by fear. She feeds you lies to isolate you from the only person who actually loves you. But she tells a very different story when she thinks nobody else is listening." Without breaking my intense stare, I reached my steady hand down and opened the small wooden drawer built into the side of the coffee table. I pulled out a compact, sleek black Bluetooth speaker and placed it deliberately onto the glass surface right next to the rejected contract. I pulled my mobile phone from my shirt pocket and tapped the illuminated screen. The Bluetooth connection chimed with a sharp electronic beep. I pressed play. The crystal-clear, high-definition audio recording flooded the quiet living room, the volume turned up to maximum capacity. Harrison's voice echoed from the speaker, first dripping with complaints about the smell of my home and his ruined suit. Then Sylvia's voice filled the air. It was not the sweet, caring tone she used around Bradley. It was the vicious, arrogant, and highly predatory voice she reserved for the shadows. "Oh, stop whining, Harrison!" The recorded Sylvia snapped her words sharp and cruel. "It is just ice water. You can buy 10 suits by next week. Just endure the smell for one more day. We are almost at the finish line." Bradley physically recoiled, his jaw dropping open as he heard the sheer malice in his new wife's voice. He stared at the black speaker as if it were a venomous snake. "His performance makes our case foolproof." The recording continued, Sylvia's laughter ringing out like breaking glass. "Once the old fool signs the conservatorship clause on page 12, we lock him in the Sunnydale Psychiatric Facility by Friday. The director owes me a massive favor, and he has already prepared a secure room in the locked ward. Robert will be medicated, isolated, and completely stripped of his rights." "No," Bradley whispered, shaking his head in rapid denial. He turned to look at Sylvia, his eyes begging her to tell him it was a lie, a trick, a manipulation. But Sylvia was completely trapped. She stared at the speaker, her perfectly constructed illusion shattering into a million irreparable pieces. I watched my son sink to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, as the brutal truth destroyed his life. Sylvia stepped backward, bumping into the heavy wooden bookshelf. She gasped for air, her face entirely pale. Harrison scrambled desperately to pack his expensive leather briefcase, completely abandoning all professional composure. The absolute silence returned when the recording finally ended. I folded my hands tightly together and stared at the two predators who had foolishly underestimated me. They were absolutely finished, broken, ruined. The heavy silence in my living room was shattered by the sound of Bradley taking a sharp, ragged breath. He slowly pulled his hands away from his face and looked up at the woman he had promised to love and cherish for the rest of his life. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and swimming with a profound, agonizing confusion that slowly morphed into absolute horror. The recorded words still hung in the damp air, echoing the cold, calculated cruelty of a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a stepping stone to a massive fortune. Bradley stared at Sylvia as if a stranger had just ripped off a lifelike mask. He had spent the last 3 months living in a state of constant, suffocating terror, convinced that violent men were coming to break his legs over a fabricated debt. He had agonized over the decision to evict his own father, crying himself to sleep, while Sylvia stroked his hair and whispered that he was doing the right thing for everyone. Now, the sickening reality of her psychological torture laid itself bare before him. She had manufactured the debt, hired the actors, and systematically broken his spirit, all to maneuver him into handing over a trust fund he did not even know existed. "Sylvia," Bradley whispered, his voice trembling and breaking under the weight of his shattered reality. "You lied to me. You told me the loan sharks were going to hurt us. You told me my dad was sick, that he needed to be in a facility for his own good. You set this all up just to lock him away in a psychiatric ward. You were going to let me inherit the money and then divorce me." Sylvia did not respond with tears or apologies. The sweet, caring facade she had maintained for over a year vanished in a single heartbeat. Her posture straightened, her shoulders pulling back as she dropped the submissive wife routine entirely. She looked down at my weeping son with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. Her features hardened into a mask of sharp angles and cold calculation. She scoffed, a short, ugly sound that cut through Bradley's remaining hope. "Oh, please, Bradley, stop crying like a pathetic child," Sylvia snapped, her voice dripping with venomous contempt. "You honestly thought a woman like me would marry a weak, aimless loser like you, out of pure love? You could not even stand up to a couple of cheap actors pretending to be mobsters. You folded the second things became difficult. You were so desperate for a strong woman to guide you that you practically handed me the leash. I did what I had to do because you were too much of a coward to claim what was rightfully yours. $110 million sitting in a bank account while you scraped by on a meager salary. It is pathetic. Someone had to take charge of this family, and you clearly did not have the spine for it." Bradley shrank back against the base of the sofa, clutching his knees to his chest. He looked like a hollow shell of a man completely destroyed by the realization that his entire marriage, his entire sense of self, was a meticulously engineered lie. He had sacrificed his relationship with his father, his moral compass, and his dignity for a woman who despised him. The father-son bond we had shared was officially irreparably broken, shattered by his weakness and her unyielding greed. I felt a cold detachment settle over my heart as I watched him weep. He was no longer the boy I needed to protect. He was an adult who had made his choice, and he was finally suffering the consequences of his profound cowardice. Sylvia turned away from him in disgust, dismissing his existence entirely. She locked her sharp, predatory gaze onto me. She was cornered, her primary plan completely dismantled, but she was far from defeated. A true predator never surrenders. They simply pivot, searching for a new angle of attack, a new vulnerability to exploit. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, stepping away from the bookshelf and moving toward the center of the room. She looked at the ruined contract on the coffee table, then at the Bluetooth speaker, and finally at the heavy silver pen. She took a deep breath, her calculating mind rapidly adjusting to the new battlefield. "Fine," Sylvia sneered, her voice dropping into a dangerous, threatening register. "You caught me, Robert. You played the senile fool brilliantly, and I underestimated you. I will admit that. You have your little audio recording, and you have exposed my plan to your pathetic son. You are incredibly rich, and you managed to protect your precious trust fund today. Congratulations. But this is far from over. You might have won this morning, but I am still legally married to Bradley, and that gives me leverage you cannot simply ignore." I remained perfectly still, resting my hands flat against the glass table. "You have absolutely no leverage, Sylvia. You are just a pathetic fraud. I am a wife in a community property state." She corrected me, a wicked, triumphant smile twisting her lips. "I am legally bound to your primary beneficiary. So here is the new deal, Robert. You are going to transfer $10 million into my personal offshore account by the end of business today. If you do that, I will quietly pack my bags, file for a clean annulment, and walk out of your lives forever. I will disappear just like you wanted." Harrison, who had been silently creeping toward the front door, stopped in his tracks. He stared at Sylvia in disbelief, clearly terrified by her brazen extortion attempt in the presence of legal counsel. "And if I refuse your generous offer?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "If you refuse, I will make your final years a living nightmare," Sylvia promised, stepping closer to the table. "I will file for a highly publicized, incredibly messy divorce. I will claim that Bradley subjected me to severe emotional and physical abuse throughout our marriage. I will drag your family name through the mud, leaking fabricated stories to the press until you are both social pariahs. I will hire the most aggressive litigators in the state, and we will attack the Carolyn Trust from every conceivable angle. We will tie up your assets in endless probate litigation, demanding spousal support, emotional damages, and half of Bradley's future inheritance. I will bleed you dry in legal fees alone. Even if you win, the process will consume years of your life, and you will die miserable, exhausted, and fighting me." She leaned over the table, bringing her face inches from mine, her eyes burning with pure toxic greed. "You have $110 million, Robert. $10 million is a minor inconvenience for you. It is a small price to pay to save your son from a lifetime of misery and public humiliation. You caught me, so pay me to walk away. Buy your peace, old man. If you refuse, I will destroy whatever is left of your fragile family." Her venomous words hung in the damp, quiet air of the living room, a desperate final strike from a cornered, vicious predator. Sylvia stood panting, her chest heaving, as she waited for me to crumble under the immense pressure of her ultimate ultimatum. She believed threatening public humiliation, fabricating domestic abuse, and promising endless probate litigation would successfully force my hand. She assumed that, like my terrified son, I was a weak coward who would happily surrender $10 million simply to buy peace and avoid a public scandal. Harrison watched me with terrified eyes, his shallow breathing echoing in the quiet cabin. He was calculating his own massive legal exposure now that his client had resorted to blatant extortion right in front of him. Bradley remained curled against the sofa, weeping into his trembling hands, broken by the magnitude of the woman he had chosen to marry. He was a hollow shell of a man. I did not flinch. I simply looked at the greedy woman standing across the table and allowed a slow, incredibly cold, and absolutely terrifying smile to spread across my face. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the smile of an executioner watching the trapdoor swing open. Sylvia saw that smile, and her rigid posture faltered for the first time. A flicker of genuine fear cracked through her confident facade. I reached into my flannel shirt pocket and slowly pulled out my mobile phone. I unlocked the screen with a deliberate swipe of my thumb and placed the device gently onto the center of the coffee table, right beside the ruined power of attorney contract. The screen glowed brightly, clearly displaying an active audio call connected for over 30 minutes. I pressed the speakerphone button with a decisive click. "Mitchell," I said, my voice echoing firmly and with unwavering authority throughout the space. "Are you currently on the line? Have you been quietly listening to this entire exchange?" The deep, professional, and razor-sharp voice of my lead corporate attorney immediately filled the living room, projecting loudly and clearly from the small electronic speaker. "I am here, Robert," Mitchell confirmed, his tone radiating a lethal, icy calm. "I have heard absolutely everything. We have successfully recorded her explicit admission of intent to commit systemic fraud, her direct confirmation of the fabricated loan shark debt, and her blatant, highly illegal attempt at financial extortion." Harrison let out a choked, suffocated gasp, stumbling awkwardly backward until his spine hit the wooden wall with a loud thud. He knew his career, his freedom, and his entire life were now completely over. He was an accessory to a massive criminal conspiracy. I turned my gaze back to my daughter-in-law, locking my eyes intensely onto hers. "Sylvia," I said, leaning forward and resting my palms flat against the smooth glass surface. "You truly thought you were the smartest person in this entire room. You actually thought you had engineered a flawless, undetectable, hostile takeover of my estate. But my late wife Carolyn was so much smarter than you could ever possibly comprehend. She grew up with absolutely nothing, and she knew exactly what sudden, massive wealth could do to weak people. She anticipated that one day a parasitic, soulless opportunist just like you might try to manipulate my advancing age or manipulate our foolish son to steal her legacy." Sylvia swallowed hard, her mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. She could not find a single word to say. "By actively bringing that fraudulent contract into my home today," I continued, my voice striking like a heavy iron hammer against an anvil, "and by explicitly attempting to force a conservatorship under demonstrably false pretenses, you did not secure your luxurious future. You just legally triggered the ultimate irreversible failsafe. You triggered the predator clause of the Carolyn Trust." Sylvia stared at me, her dark eyes wide with rapidly rising panic. "What are you talking about? What stupid clause that is absolutely impossible? My private investigator checked every single document. Your expensive investigator checked the standard public financial filings, Sylvia," Mitchell interjected through the speakerphone, his voice dripping with pure, undeniable legal dominance. "He did not have the necessary security clearance to access the highly classified dormant contingency charters. Allow me to clarify your current miserable reality. The predator clause clearly dictates that in the event of a hostile medical proxy takeover, the foundational trust parameters instantly mutate. At exactly 9:14 this morning, the precise moment you aggressively confirmed your malicious intent on this recorded line, the primary triggering condition was completely and undeniably met." Mitchell paused briefly, letting the heavy silence stretch to maximize the devastating, world-shattering impact of his next words. "The entirety of the $110 million trust was permanently, irrevocably dissolved," Mitchell announced coldly. "The funds have already been electronically transferred out of the primary holding accounts. The money is completely gone, Sylvia. It has been successfully moved and permanently locked into the Carolyn Foundation for Orphaned Children, securing it exclusively for philanthropic medical research across the globe. Your husband Bradley has been legally and completely disinherited by default. There is zero money left to claim in your inevitable divorce. You just burned the entire fortune to the very ground. Sylvia's face contorted in absolute unadulterated horror. The blood rushed completely from her cheeks, leaving her skin a sickly, ghostly white. Her perfectly painted lips trembled violently as the catastrophic, undeniable reality of her own actions crashed down upon her shoulders. She had spent months plotting, lying, gaslighting her husband, and risking serious federal prison time, all for a massive payday that had just evaporated into thin air because of her own blinding, toxic arrogance. She looked at the phone, then at the ruined contract, and finally down at her empty hands. "No," Sylvia gasped, her voice completely devoid of its previous venom, reduced to a hollow, desperate, and pathetic wheeze. "No, you cannot do that. That is my money. You cannot just give it away. That is entirely illegal." "It is entirely legal, and it is entirely finished," Mitchell countered smoothly over the speaker, sealing her fate. "The electronic transfer is permanent and irreversible. You inherit absolutely nothing. Furthermore, the local authorities have already been actively dispatched to your current location. Your extortion attempt and your conspiracy to commit elder fraud have been documented and submitted directly to the district attorney. The police are on their way." Bradley slowly lifted his head from his wet hands, looking at the woman who had systematically destroyed his entire life. He finally saw her for what she truly was. She was not a loving savior. She was a vicious, calculating parasite who had just violently lost her host. Sylvia let out a piercing, hysterical, and deafening scream of pure, unbridled rage. She dropped heavily to her knees on the cold, hardwood floor as her perfect, incredibly wealthy future turned to permanent ash. I stood tall, feeling absolutely no pity for the wreckage she had caused. The trap had closed flawlessly. My checkmate was absolute, leaving the predators with nothing but the devastating consequences of their greed. Harrison was the first to physically react to the monumental collapse of their operation. The sharply dressed lawyer who had walked into my home with the arrogant swagger of an untouchable legal titan was suddenly reduced to a trembling mess. He stared at the mobile phone on the coffee table as if it were an active explosive. The weight of Mitchell's words had completely shattered his professional armor. He fully understood the catastrophic legal implications of the predator clause, and he understood the devastating reality of his own criminal exposure. He had actively participated in a conspiracy to commit massive financial fraud, elder abuse, and extortion. The realization that my legal team possessed a crystal-clear audio recording of their entire plot sent an uncontrollable shudder down his spine. He scrambled backwards, his expensive leather shoes slipping against the hardwood floor. His hands shook with frantic energy as he reached for his soaked briefcase. He shoved the ruined pages of the fraudulent contract inside, fumbling with the brass latches before snapping them shut. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this," Harrison stammered, his voice cracking into a panicked squeak. "I was retained for a standard property transfer. I was unaware of any hostile intentions." He was desperately trying to establish a flimsy alibi, but his terrified eyes betrayed his guilt. I stared at him, my expression completely devoid of mercy. "Save your pathetic lies for the district attorney," I replied, my voice echoing coldly in the room. "Your license is finished. You will be remarkably lucky if you avoid serving a decade in federal prison." Harrison did not attempt to argue. He did not offer another word of defense. He turned and sprinted toward the front door. He scrambled desperately with the deadbolt, throwing the door open and practically falling down the steps. He ran toward his parked car with the terrified speed of a man running for his life, completely abandoning his client. Sylvia did not turn her head to watch her cowardly accomplice flee the scene. She remained firmly planted on her knees, staring blankly at the glass table. The triumphant, untouchable predator, who had boldly demanded $10 million only moments ago, had completely vanished. In her place was a broken shell of a woman attempting to process the absolute permanent destruction of her entire future. The silence in the cabin was suddenly shattered by a sound so primal and horrifying that it chilled my blood. Sylvia let out a piercing, guttural scream. It was the furious, deafening shriek of a banshee, realizing she had been completely outsmarted. She slammed her fists violently against the hardwood floor, her knuckles turning red from the brutal impact. She had wasted over 2 years of her life meticulously crafting this elaborate psychological operation. She had endured countless months playing the role of the sweet, caring fiancé. She had actually married a man she openly despised, binding herself to a coward simply to gain access to a vault she believed was unguarded. She had sacrificed her time, her energy, and her sanity for a singular, massive payout, and now she was left with absolutely nothing. The $110 million were gone. The trust was permanently dissolved. She was legally bound to a penniless husband, and her entire criminal conspiracy was fully documented. She slowly pushed herself up from the floor, her chest heaving, her perfectly styled hair now hanging in messy strands across her pale face. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, burning with an intense, toxic hatred. "You completely ruined my life!" Sylvia hissed, her voice vibrating with a raw, unhinged fury. "I gave up everything for this. You have absolutely no right to take that money away from me. It was mine. I earned it." I looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. "You earned absolutely nothing, Sylvia." I stated, my voice flat and devoid of any sympathy. "You are a parasite who attempted to feast on the hard work of a brilliantly paranoid woman. You brought this entirely upon yourself, and your misery is only just beginning." I stepped closer to the table, asserting my total dominance over the room. "Mitchell and I did not just send those audio recordings to the local police department. While you were demanding an extortion payment, my legal team successfully transmitted the entire digital package directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Elder Fraud Unit currently possesses the explicit audio of your confession, the fraudulent contract, and a comprehensive paper trail exposing the fake loan sharks you hired to terrorize your husband. You are not just facing a messy, highly publicized divorce. You are facing federal racketeering and extortion charges." Sylvia stumbled backward as if I had struck her across the face. The last shred of her arrogant defiance crumbled, replaced by the sheer, suffocating terror of a federal prison sentence. She looked around the rustic cabin, her eyes darting wildly as if searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. She realized with absolute certainty that her life was entirely over. Without speaking another word, she turned and marched toward the open front door. Her movements were rigid and robotic. She stumbled down the porch steps, nearly twisting her ankle in her designer heels, and practically threw herself into the driver's seat of her heavy SUV. The engine roared to life with an aggressive surge of power. She threw the vehicle into reverse, the thick tires spinning wildly and kicking up a massive cloud of gray dust and sharp gravel. She peeled out of my driveway at a dangerous speed, fleeing the scene of her ultimate humiliating defeat. The heavy roar of the departing engine slowly faded into the dense Bellevue pines, leaving a profound, echoing silence in its wake. I stood in the center of the living room, listening to the quiet rustle of the wind against the cabin windows. The immediate threat had been successfully neutralized. The predators had been forcefully expelled from my sanctuary. I slowly turned my gaze away from the open front door and looked down at the floor. Bradley was still there. He had not moved a single muscle during Sylvia's hysterical breakdown or Harrison's cowardly retreat. He remained kneeling on the damp hardwood, his shoulders shaking violently as he wept into his hands. He looked incredibly small, fragile, and broken. The false reality he had inhabited for the last year had been violently ripped away, leaving him exposed to the horrifying truth of his own profound weakness. He had blindly believed fabricated lies because he was too afraid to ask for the truth. He slowly pulled his wet hands away from his face and looked up at me. His eyes were red and swollen, swimming with a desperate, pathetic need for absolution. "Dad," Bradley choked out, his voice cracking into a miserable whisper. I am so sorry. I did not know anything about the trust fund or the psychiatric hospital. She brainwashed me. She made me believe the mobsters were going to kill us. Please forgive me. I simply stood perfectly still, coldly looking down at the utterly broken, weeping man I had raised from childhood. My only son remained on the hardwood floor, a sobbing, broken mess. His arms wrapped tightly around his knees, he rocked back and forth, shattered by his own choices. He looked up, his tear-stained face twisted in agonizing regret. Pushing himself onto his knees, he reached out his trembling hands, grasping at the air. He wanted a hug. He desperately wanted me to pull him into my chest, to stroke his hair, and promise him that everything would be all right, just like when he was a little boy. He wanted the unconditional safety of his father. I did not move a single inch. I kept my arms resting firmly at my sides, my posture rigid and expression unreadable. I looked down at the son I had sacrificed so much to protect, feeling nothing but a hollow, aching emptiness. The bridge between us had been burned to ashes, and he was the one who struck the match. Please, Dad. Bradley whimpered, his voice barely a breath. Please forgive me. I lost everything. I have absolutely nothing left. You did not lose everything today, Bradley, I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of warmth. You lost me the moment you allowed a vicious stranger to convince you to throw your own father into the street. You chose to believe a ridiculous lie because it was easier than standing up for the man who gave you life. You chose the path of a coward. Bradley flinched as if I had physically struck him. He lowered his hands, letting them fall uselessly to his sides. As for the inheritance, I continued pacing slowly across the living room to look out the front window. You should not mourn a fortune you never even knew you had. That immense wealth was a ghost, a heavy burden that your mother and I carried in complete silence to ensure it did not corrupt you. Unfortunately, your innate weakness invited corruption anyway. But you do not need to worry about the trust fund anymore. The money is doing good in the world now. It will heal sick children and build hospitals. It will serve a profound purpose rather than funding the empty parasitic lifestyle of a woman who completely despised you. I turned back to face him. He was staring at the floorboards again, the truth of my words crushing whatever tiny shred of hope he had left. I am not going to abandon you to starve, Bradley, I stated, walking back toward the coffee table and picking up the heavy silver pen. You are still my son, even if my respect for you is completely gone. I will pay for you to undergo intensive psychological therapy because you clearly need professional help to undo the extensive brainwashing you eagerly accepted. Furthermore, I will arrange for a basic structured living stipend. You will receive exactly $2,000 on the first of every month. That money will cover a modest apartment and basic groceries. Bradley looked up, his eyes widening slightly, with a mixture of immense shame and deep relief. He opened his mouth to utter a pathetic word of gratitude, but I raised my hand to immediately silence him. Do not thank me, I ordered sharply, because this assistance comes with a very strict, unbreakable boundary. You will receive that stipend for exactly 1 year. 12 months, Bradley. Not a single day longer. You will use that time to find a steady job, to finalize your humiliating divorce, and to figure out how to navigate the real world without a safety net. After that final check clears, you are completely on your own. I will not answer calls for emergency funds. I will not bail you out of debt. I will not be your financial savior ever again. It is time you finally became a man. He understood that the era of blind paternal protection was permanently over. He gathered his jacket from the floor, his movements slow and agonizingly sluggish. He did not ask for a hug again. He simply offered one last lingering look of profound sorrow before turning around and walking out the front door, stepping out into the cold morning air alone. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving the cabin in absolute, uninterrupted silence. The chaotic storm that had violently invaded my sanctuary was finally gone. I walked slowly through the quiet living room, picking up the discarded Bluetooth speaker and the ridiculous legal contract, tossing them both into the nearby trash can. The air inside the house suddenly felt incredibly clear light and completely pure. I walked out onto the back porch, stepping into the warm, comforting embrace of the bright morning sun. The towering Bellevue pine trees swayed gently in the crisp breeze, casting long, dancing shadows across the wooden deck. I walked over to my sturdy workbench, running my fingers over the smooth, unfinished surface of a large oak dining chair I had been carefully building for weeks. I picked up a block of rough sandpaper and a heavy wooden mallet, the familiar calloused grip of the tools grounding me in the present moment. The immense suffocating burden of the secret wealth was officially gone. I was no longer the silent guardian of a corporate empire constantly waiting for the inevitable arrival of greedy predators. I was just Robert again, a simple man with a quiet life in the woods. I reached into my flannel shirt pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was a picture of Carolyn taken decades ago on our very first anniversary. Her bright, intelligent eyes looked back at me, radiating the fierce, protective wisdom that had ultimately saved our family legacy. "You were right, my love," I whispered to the photograph, my voice thick with deep, overwhelming gratitude and lasting affection. "It worked perfectly. Your foundation is fully funded, and the predators have been banished to the dark." I placed the beautiful photograph gently onto the corner of the workbench, securing it safely beneath a smooth glass paperweight. I picked up the sandpaper, took a deep cleansing breath of the fresh mountain air, and returned to sanding the solid oak wood. The rhythmic scraping sound filled the quiet porch. For the first time in over a decade, I was finally at peace. Sometimes the hardest truth to accept is that the people we love are capable of profound betrayal when blinded by greed or manipulation. True strength isn't found in endlessly protecting those who hurt you, but in having the courage to set unbreakable boundaries. Wealth and material possessions will always attract masks and lies, but character is revealed in how we treat the vulnerable when we think no one is looking. Do not let family ties become a chain that drags you into darkness. Forgiveness is a virtue, but protecting your peace, your dignity, and your legacy is an absolute duty. If this story resonated with you today, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another journey. Tell me down in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Robert's shoes? I read every single comment. See you in the next story.